As I come into this room, there are so many thoughts and feelings that I have because I was one of the first groups that moved into this seminary. All of my first year of theology, we were up in Darlington in Mawa, and then my second year of theology, we moved back here. And so I walk into this room, and I remember when we walked into here as a new seminary for us to be living in. And a few things, just one of the things that I'm thinking of, my gosh, um, the food was just meh, okay. And at night, they would put out like a bowl of pretzels for the seminarians for if you wanted a snack at night. But if you walked through this door into the priest's dining room, they had a whole array of cold cuts and beer and the wine and all this stuff. And it was just wonderful, but we were not permitted to go through that door. But I used to come in here with Father Peter Finesti at midnight, and we would go in there and we would get bologna and salami. And if we ever got caught, and Guy said, if Father Guarino catches you, you're going to be out. And I thought, gee, it'd be really terrible to be thrown out of the seminary and not be a priest over a bologna sandwich. But it was just too tempting to not want to go in there and get a midnight snack. But another thing I think of in this room, if you were to take a sharp instrument, some little sharp instrument that maybe you might have with you, and go up to some of the walls of this refectory and begin to chip away at the paint, I guess over time you would get down to the original color of this room when we moved in here. 45 years ago, I guess it is now. It was a shock to us when we walked into this room when we arrived because the entire room was painted a very curious and nauseating Pepto Bismol pink. That's the God's honest truth. Everyone reacted, and we couldn't figure out who picked that color and why. But it was very quickly painted over, as you might imagine. But when I come into this room, it's one of the first things I see is the pink color that was all over, not just any pink, but as I said, if you know Pepto Bismol, it was that color pink. And it reminds me of color. It reminded me a little bit of color, like what color does, and sometimes it sticks in our hearts, in our memories, right? Color can do so much for us. And sometimes I wonder, why did God create a world with color? After all, we could have lived and loved and hated. We could have achieved salvation or lost it in a world of black and white. So, why did God bother to make a world filled with color? I think the reason is that God, above all else, we might say, is an artist. And God created a world steeped in beauty with a small b, so that within it we might discern beauty with a capital B. God Himself, the God who is beauty. And He instilled within each one of us that ability to see beauty through color and form and radiance and clarity. Those things that we use to define what is beautiful. Have you ever wondered or thought about what God's favorite color might be? Well, I've given that some thought. Maybe the Bible gives us some clues. We look at how many times colors are mentioned in the Bible. The color red, 50 times in the Bible. Yellow and green, 4 times each. The color blue, 49 times. But I think maybe a case can be made that God's favorite color is purple because it's mentioned the most, 53 times in the Bible. It just happens to be my favorite color too. So I guess I just happened to notice that. But the color of vestments and the appointments in the temple, as we read in the Old Testament, the only color the Bible tells us that Christ wore on Good Friday. For the church in her liturgy, the liturgical seasons color, the purple color of Lent or Advent, these beautiful seasons of renewal and repentance and hope and preparation. Years ago, there was an interesting book out that was called Mauve, The Color That Changed the World. It was the story of a scientist named William Perkin, who as a teen in 1856 was a lab assistant, and he was helping out with some malaria treatment that they were trying to make some headways with. But by accident, he combined some of the wrong elements, and all of a sudden, this purple sludge kind of emerged. And Perkins actually created by accident the first purple dye. And it was really incredible because before that, the color purple dye had to be taken drop by drop from a particular type of oyster. It was a very difficult dye or color to come to get. But the technology that William Perkins sort of discovered by accident had made great headways in terms of technology, defense, food, and even working with different kinds of illnesses. So purple was indeed the color that changed the world. What does all of this have to do with our gathering today? Well, when Father Dominic asked me if I could come and speak as part of this day on this morning on St. Paul, he mentioned a few themes as we've been hearing about. We heard so beautifully from Sister St. Paul and women and hospitality. And when I thought of those things, I thought, all right, how am I going to put all those together in a 20-minute reflection? One person came to mind, and it's someone that we've mentioned a few times already, and that is Lydia. Saint Lydia, as she's sometimes called, Saint Lydia Purpuraria, Saint Lydia the Purple. I've had the chance twice in my life to be in Philippi at the spot where this conversion happened. It's not really a place of hospitality because there's a little Orthodox church there on the bank of this river, and we were not permitted to go in there and celebrate Mass because we were Roman Catholic. So we celebrated Mass outside on the river, which was actually kind of nice too. But in Acts 16, it tells us that Paul met her in Philippi. She was a God-fearer, meaning that she was not a Jew, but she was attracted to the God of the Jews. She's also a businesswoman, as we heard, a dealer in purple goods. And because purple was so difficult to get, people who dealt in purple tended to be very wealthy people. I like to think of Lydia as a person of style, kind of like the Vera Wang or the Martha Stewart of her day. Martha Stewart, though, without the thing on her ankle she had to wear when she got out of prison. Lydia was an artist, I think, a designer, someone that understood beauty, and so was Paul. Lydia was captivated by the preaching of St. Paul, and she gave her life. And as we heard, as we saw in that Visio Divina, her entire household were baptized. But in Lydia, Lydia took the gospel. It made a huge step from the Middle East and Asia, the continent of Asia, into Europe. Lydia was the first European to give her life to Christ. And what's the first thing she did? Sister mentioned it, or maybe Father Dominic, maybe they both mentioned it. The first thing Lydia did, she offered hospitality to Paul. She became immediately aware that faith implied action, and so hospitality was something that was crucial for her to offer. Maybe Paul was attracted to her because or noticed her because he liked the color purple as well. I'm not sure. But I think of her when I thought of Paul and women and hospitality. Immediately I thought of St. Lydia. What is hospitality? The art of making people feel welcome, cordial and generous reception of or disposition toward guests. In the 12th chapter of Paul to the Romans, Paul invites the Romans to share with the Lord's people who are in need. And then he says very simply, practice hospitality. We're told that he used the Greek word, a Greek word, um, philoxenia, which means love to strangers. So that's certainly an important element of it. What role does hospitality play in our church and in our actions and in our preaching? In the first century, Israel, I imagine, was not necessarily known for its hospitality to women, but St. Paul was a person of hospitality to all people. Just read this beautiful letter that Father Dominic wrote in our brochure here today. St. Paul, without using the words to the Colossians, really gives us some of the qualities that are related to hospitality. To clothe yourself with compassion and kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, clothing yourselves with love. Perhaps hospitality is very much, very beautifully, a cousin to love, very much connected to the beauty of love. But St. Paul was a person of hospitality to all people. And we see it especially in the way that he dealt with women. Is it just an accident that St. Luke, who they tell us records for us the preaching of Paul because he was friends with St. Paul? Luke is the one who wrote the Gospel of Women, as the Gospel of Luke is called. So maybe there was a connection. He was hearing St. Paul preaching. And so these were the things that St. Luke was inspired to write himself. Henry Nouwen described hospitality as receiving the stranger on his own terms, and says that it can be offered only by those who have found the center of their lives in their own hearts, so that there is an interior disposition that predisposes us then to be people of hospitality. He called listening a form of spiritual hospitality, by which you invite strangers to become friends, to get to know their inner selves more fully, and even to dare to be silent with you. And as St. Paul shows us in his relationship with Lydia, hospitality is not just about giving, but it's also about receiving. As St. Paul gave hospitality, so he was willing to receive it from another. There's some of you here are perhaps very comfortable being hospitable, giving it, but maybe it's harder to receive it. Those of you who are doers, who have a hard time letting people do something for you, we know people like that in our lives, maybe we ourselves. Sister Joan Chittister said that hospitality is the key to new ideas, new friends, new possibilities. What we take into our lives changes us. Without new people and new ideas, we are imprisoned inside ourselves. Sister mentioned a few times today Saint Therese, the child Jesus, my favorite saint. I love the story. One of my favorite stories about her, she lived in the Carmel of Lisieux with a prioress, Mother Marie de Gonzague, who was a little bit of an odd duck, we might say, a little bit of a strange personality. There's lots of stories about Therese and Mother Marie, but one of a really great story, I think, and very practical for us is Mother Marie had a sister who was a very wealthy person who would have arguments with her husband. And when she would fight with her husband, she would come to the Carmel of Lisieux and she would live there at the Carmel in the monastery or in the guest room, I guess, with the nuns. And one day she had a big fight with her husband. She arrived in the middle of the night. And in the very precise schedule of a Carmelite monastery, Mother Marie woke up the nuns and they had to be like servants to her sister who had showed up. And so Therese had to go and had to prepare a lamp for the sister of the mother prioress. And she did it with resentment until all of a sudden she writes about having the thought, she said, if I were preparing this lamp in the middle of the night for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, for the Holy Family who had come here, I would do it with great love and great attention. So the temptation against hospitality was something that faith helped her to look at in a totally different way. Perhaps that's something we might do with people when maybe it's difficult for us to show hospitality to others, to think that in being hospitable to them, we might be being hospitable to Christ himself. I was a stranger and you welcomed me, our Lord said. For priests, and I wasn't sure if there were going to be any seminarians here today. I heard some of them were going to come, but then they got the weekend off, so they all took off for the weekend. I don't blame them. But for priests, hospitality, I think, is a function of human formation. Because a priest can be Thomas Aquinas in his theology. He can be John Vianney in his spirituality. He can be Francis of Assisi in his asceticism personally. But if he's not kind and welcoming, who cares? And we say that to young seminarians who come and spend the summer with us very often in Ramsey. No one will care. You can be the smartest guy in the room, the holiest guy in the room. But if you're not hospitable, if you're not welcoming, if your people don't see a kindness in you, who cares? You're not going to do any good for the Lord and for the church. How would our church be if parishes were able to be more hospitable and more welcoming? Right? What a difference. And that's something that we all need to work on, but not just the priests, also the people in the pews. right? We know the people who go into the pew and sit like the lion in front of the New York Library like this. I'm not moving in. So if you want to come in, I will maybe step out so you can walk in, but I ain't moving. This is my seat, right? So what about hospitality? Do we all see ourselves as people who are called to hospitality? It is a crucial form of faith in action. I always thought if I were a professor in this seminary teaching, preaching to seminarians, I would make them study Paul's preaching at the Areopagus. Maybe you remember that story. It's coming up, I think, in the Acts of the Apostles. Those of you who go to daily mass, we're reading through the 50-day season of Easter, the Acts of the Apostles. More than anything else, what Paul speaks about at the Areopagus shows his brilliance and his hospitality. 3 times in my life, I've had the great joy of visiting the Areopagus. If you've ever been to the city of Athens, it's a small outcropping of rocks. And that was a place where the court of the Areopagus met. And it was a very powerful group of people who would meet there in the first century. And I imagine puny little Jewish tent maker Paul engaging the power of Athens, going there. But St. Paul goes to this Areopagus, and he's going to speak to these power people in Athens. And if you've ever been there, he's in the shadow of the great temple of Athena Parthenos, the Parthenon. That's right. It's like towering over this little outcropping of rocks, this power place of paganism. We imagine little Paul going there and standing and talking to this group of people. I've read that it was probably no more than about 30 people, but he's there and he's speaking to them. There, Paul encounters the intellectual and political elite of his time. As I heard in a movie recently, it's not genius alone that changes the world. It also takes courage. So Paul had genius, but he also had the courage. He wasn't afraid. Paul's words, though, to the people there shows that he did his homework. He knew his audience, not to mock or belittle them, but to invite them. So Paul begins with an admiration for their culture and experience. He's talking to these people, these powerful people, and at least he took the time to know and understand it. He said to them, I've been in your city, I've spent time in your city, and I saw an altar to an unknown God. So I'm here to speak to you about the God that is unknown to you. He was aware of their philosophers, their philosophies, and their poets. In fact, he quotes one of their poets, a pagan poet, Epimenides, who wrote in a poem to Zeus. They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being. Remember that line? It's a beautiful line. It even comes up in one of the prefaces at Mass. I forget which one it's in. But Paul brings them an even deeper understanding of their own wisdom and their own art. And he begins to preach Christ to them, not with great theology first, but with an appeal to the beauty of creation, their experience. He goes there first, and he helps them to see and understand the artist who created it, the God, St. Paul said, who made the universe and everything in it, not one who stands apart from it, but one who is present within it. What a great grace it is to be able to see God in the beauty of creation. And that's where Paul starts with these powerful people. Probably my favorite poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She wrote, Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries. She's talking about noticing, being mindful of the beauty of God in creation that's all around us. Paul is telling them that the God he came to preach is, shockingly enough, the God who knows you and loves you. And we are his offspring. He's not far from any of us. In him we live and move and have our being. To me, that's hospitable preaching. To know the people you're speaking to have cared enough to spend time to get to know them. so that when you speak to them, you can find common ground, not as if you're the person imposing something on them, but rather the one who with them is trying to draw something out that you can do and be together. Paul reverences and respects the other. It appeals to a common experience, and it exudes, I think, a certain warmth, hopefulness, joy, and beauty. And that is Paul, the artist. Someone once said, all good art leads to silence. The Bible is silent on the seeds that Paul planted that day. In fact, it tells us they sort of said, don't call us, we'll call you. But who knows what seeds Paul may have planted in that expression of his hospitality. But we do know the Bible tells us that Paul touched the hearts of one man and one woman. Dionysius the Areopagite, we call him, and Damaris, another woman that we didn't, there's, I guess, a few others besides the one Father Dominic pointed out to us, Saint Damaris. And the Orthodox Church seems to do a better job than we do in remembering these saints, right? They have feast days and for saints that we sort of like glaze over or we don't pay much attention to in the Latin Church. But I thought to myself, wow, two saints out of 30, he's talking to 30 people, two of them became saints. That's pretty good. If God used every sermon of mine to help two people become saints, I'll be well pleased. So that was pretty good. Damaris and Dionysius. In Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, you mentioned that 20 minutes ago, that the name of the book. In that, I think, beautiful novel, the terribly abused and forgotten Miss Seeley walks through a field of purple wildflowers with Shug Avery, the only person in her life that notices her and loves her. And Shug says, you know, Miss Seeley, I think it pisses God off when we walk through a field of the color purple and not notice. Everything wants to be noticed. Everything just wants to be loved. May we walk through this world and notice, as Paul did. Notice the God in the beauty of his creation. Notice God in the other, man or woman, slave or free, Jew or Greek. The God of hospitality, the hospitable God who welcomes with warmth, who invites movement and growth with hope, and who loves with abandon. May we never forget it is in him that we live and move and have our being. To him be glory forever. Amen.